The world didn't stop spinning when I found out I was pregnant, but it sure as hell felt like it. My name is Riley Carter, a 28-year-old trans man living in the pulsing heart of Brooklyn, and I'd just been handed a truth that could unravel everything I'd fought for. In a cramped clinic room, with fluorescent lights buzzing like a bad omen, the doctor's words hit me like a freight train. "You're pregnant, Riley." 8 weeks. I sat there, gripping the edge of the examination table, my knuckles white. Pregnant. Me. A guy who'd spent years carving out his identity, navigating a world that didn't always know what to do with a trans man like me. I'd been on testosterone for years, had top surgery, and built a life where I finally felt like myself. But biology doesn't care about your plans, and here I was, facing a reality I'd never imagined. My partner, Julian Navarro, was waiting outside, probably scrolling through his phone, unaware that our lives were about to be flipped upside down. I met Julian, 32, at a queer poetry slam in the East Village 2 years ago. He's a Dominican-American artist with a laugh that could light up a blackout and eyes that see right through you. We'd built something real, something that felt like home in a city that could chew you up and spit you out. But this? A baby? It wasn't part of the plan, not when we were still scraping by, him with his freelance murals and me with my gig as a barista and part-time graphic designer. When I stepped out of the clinic, the Brooklyn streets felt too loud, too chaotic. Julian looked up, his curly hair catching the late afternoon sun. "You okay, Ree?" he asked, his voice soft but laced with worry. I opened my mouth, but the words stuck. How do you tell the man you love that you're carrying a life neither of you planned for, in a body you've fought so hard to claim as your own? "I'm pregnant," I blurted, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes widened, and for a moment, the world held its breath. Then he pulled me into his arms, right there on the sidewalk, and whispered, "We'll figure it out. Together." But I could feel the tremor in his voice, the weight of what this meant. In a world that often saw us as outsiders, this was a curveball we hadn't prepared for. That night, in our tiny apartment above a bodega, we sat on the couch, surrounded by the smell of paint from Julian's latest canvas. We talked until the streetlights flickered on, weighing every option. Keep the baby? Terminate? Adoption? Every choice felt like a minefield. I'd always wanted kids, someday, but the timing was brutal. My body was a battleground. Testosterone had paused my cycle years ago, or so I thought. The doctor warned that continuing the pregnancy could mean halting hormone therapy, which terrified me. It wasn't just about my body. It was about my identity, my hard-won sense of self. Julian held my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my skin. "Whatever you choose, I'm here," he said. But I could see the fear in his eyes, mirroring my own. We weren't just a couple anymore. We were about to become a family, and the world wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for us. The next day, I told my best friend, Amara, a 30-year-old non-binary photographer with a knack for cutting through bullshit. We met at a coffee shop in Williamsburg, the kind with overpriced lattes and too many succulents. Amara's dark eyes studied me as I spilled the news. "Pregnant," they said, leaning back. "Damn, Riley, that's big." They paused, then added, "But you're not cannon fodder. You're a fighter. Always have been." Cannon fodder stuck with me. It's what people called us. Trans folks, queer folks, anyone who didn't fit the mold. Disposable. Meant to be chewed up by a world that didn't care. And now, with a baby on the way, I felt it more than ever. The whispers in my head grew louder. "You can't do this. You're not ready. You're too different." But Amara was right. I'd fought for everything. My name, my body, my place in this city. I wasn't about to let fear win now. Still, the challenges were piling up. My job at the coffee shop barely covered rent, and Julian's art gigs were unpredictable. Health insurance was a nightmare, and the idea of navigating prenatal care as a trans man felt like walking into a lion's den. I'd heard horror stories, doctors misgendering patients, clinics refusing care, judgment at every turn. Julian and I started researching, diving into forums and support groups for queer parents. We found stories of hope, but also stories of loss. People who'd faced discrimination, families who'd turned their backs. My own parents hadn't spoken to me since I came out at 19. I'd built a chosen family in New York, but the thought of raising a kid without that safety net was daunting. One night, Julian came home with a small canvas, a sketch of a tiny pair of sneakers surrounded by vibrant flowers. "For them," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "If we do this, I want them to know they're loved." I broke down then, not because I was scared, but because I saw it. Us, together, building something beautiful against all odds. But the world wasn't done testing us. A week later, I got a call from my boss at the coffee shop. "Riley, we're cutting hours," she said, her tone clipped. "You're down to 2 shifts a week." I stood in our kitchen, staring at the peeling linoleum, and felt the ground shift beneath me. 2 shifts wouldn't cover groceries, let alone doctor's visits. Julian was picking up extramural gigs, but the art world was fickle, and we were barely keeping our heads above water. I started noticing the looks. Neighbors who'd always been friendly now glanced at my growing belly with confusion or judgment. At the grocery store, a cashier asked, "Is it yours?" gesturing at my stomach. I wanted to scream that this was my body, my baby, my life. Instead, I just nodded and walked away, my chest tight. Amara dragged us to a queer parenting workshop in Manhattan, held in a community center with rainbow flags and worn-out couches. The facilitator, a Black trans woman named Keisha, shared her story of raising twins with her wife. "You're not alone," she said, her voice steady. "But you've got to fight for your space in this world. For you, and for that kid." Her words lit a fire in me. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the life growing inside me, for the family Julian and I were building. By the end of the first month, I'd made my choice. I stopped testosterone, trading one piece of myself to protect another. It was the hardest decision I'd ever made, but every flutter in my belly reminded me why. Julian and I started saving every penny, cutting corners, dreaming of a future where our kid could grow up knowing they were wanted. But the road ahead was anything but smooth, and the city around us seemed ready to swallow us whole. The second month brought a new kind of chaos. Julian and I moved into a smaller apartment in Bed-Stuy to save on rent, a 1-bedroom with creaky floors and a view of a brick wall. It wasn't much, but it was ours, and we painted the walls a soft yellow to make it feel like a home. Every night, Julian would sketch ideas for a nursery we couldn't afford yet, his hands moving with a quiet determination that kept me grounded. But the outside world wasn't so kind. At my first prenatal appointment, the nurse called me Miss Carter, despite my chart clearly stating my pronouns. I corrected her, my voice firm, but the sting lingered. Julian squeezed my hand under the table, his jaw tight. "They'll learn," he whispered, but I could see the frustration in his eyes. We were navigating a system that wasn't built for us, and every step felt like a battle. Work was another minefield. With only 2 shifts a week, I started freelancing as a graphic designer, taking on late-night projects to make ends meet. My body was changing faster than I could keep up. My hips ached, my chest felt foreign, and the mirror became a stranger. I'd spent years aligning my body with my identity, and now it felt like I was losing control again. Julian noticed, of course. He'd catch me staring at myself, lost, and pull me into a hug. "You're still you, he'd say. "Always will be." But the doubts crept in. What kind of parent could I be, barely holding it together? What if our kid faced the same rejection I had? I confided in Amara over late-night texts, and they sent me a photo of a graffiti wall they'd shot in Harlem. "You are enough." It became my mantra, whispered to myself when the world felt too heavy. Then came the bombshell. Julian's biggest mural commission, a project for a community center in the Bronx, fell through. The client backed out, citing budget cuts, but we both knew it was because of the whispers about us. Word had spread about my pregnancy, and suddenly, Julian's queerness, our queerness, was too much for some people. He came home that night, his shoulders slumped, and threw his sketchbook across the room. "I'm trying, Riley," he said, his voice breaking. "I'm trying so damn hard." I held him, my own fears swallowing me whole. We were scraping by, but losing that gig was a gut punch. I started applying for more freelance work, ignoring the exhaustion that clung to me like damp clothes. At night, I'd lie awake, feeling the baby move, and wonder if I was strong enough to carry us all. One afternoon, Amara invited us to a queer art showcase in Bushwick. It was a loud, colorful space filled with people who looked like us, loved like us. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. Julian's eyes lit up as he talked to other artists, and I saw a spark of the man I'd fallen for. A gallery owner, a middle-aged lesbian named Carla, took an interest in his work. "You've got something special," she told him, handing him her card. "Let's talk." That night, we celebrated with cheap takeout and a playlist of old-school salsa. Julian spun me around our tiny living room, laughing as I stumbled over his feet. For a moment, it was just us. No judgment, no fear, just love. But the moment was fleeting. The next morning, I woke up to a voicemail from my doctor. My blood work showed complications, nothing life-threatening yet, but enough to require weekly checkups. The cost was more than we could handle, and the stress was a weight I couldn't shake. I started attending a support group for trans parents, held in a church basement in Flatbush. The stories I heard there were raw, real, people who'd lost jobs, families, homes, but kept going. One member, a trans woman named Lena, shared how she'd fought for custody of her daughter after her ex tried to use her transition against her. "You're not just fighting for you," she said, her voice steady. "You're fighting for every kid who'll need you to show them how to be brave." Her words stuck with me. I wasn't just carrying a baby, I was carrying a legacy. But the fight was wearing me down. Julian and I argued more, small, sharp fights about money, about the future. He wanted to protect me, but I didn't want to be protected. I wanted to be his equal, his partner, not a burden. One night, after a particularly bad fight, I found him on the fire escape, sketching the city skyline. "I'm scared, he admitted. "What if I can't provide for you?" "For them." I sat beside him, the cold metal biting into my thighs. "We're enough," I said, echoing Amara's words. "We'll make it work." But even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. The city was a beast, and we were just two people trying to tame it. By the end of the second month, we'd hit a breaking point. Bills were piling up, my body was a stranger, and Julian's dreams were slipping through his fingers. But there, in the quiet moments, when he'd rest his hand on my belly, or when we'd laugh over a bad movie, I saw the future we could have. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I'd fight for it, tooth and nail. The third month was a crucible. My body was changing in ways I couldn't ignore, my belly rounding, my energy sapped. Every doctor's visit brought new bills, and our savings were a ghost. Julian landed a small mural gig through Carla's gallery, but it barely covered rent. I was picking up more freelance work, designing logos and flyers until my eyes burned, but it wasn't enough. We were drowning, and the world didn't care. Then came the call that nearly broke us. My landlord, a gruff man named Mr. Esposito, left a voicemail. "Rent's going up next month, kid. Market's hot. An extra $300 a month." We couldn't afford it. Julian slammed his fist on the counter, his face a storm. "This city's trying to kill us," he said. I didn't disagree. We started looking for a new place, but the options were grim. Cramped studios in sketchy neighborhoods, or shared houses with strangers who might not take kindly to a pregnant trans man and his queer partner. Amara offered their couch, but it wasn't a solution, just a bandage. I felt like cannon fodder again, like the world was betting against us. One night, I broke down. I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by medical bills and freelance invoices, when the weight of it all hit me. Julian found me there, tears streaming down my face. He knelt beside me, his hands gentle. "We can't keep doing this," I sobbed. "What if we're not enough?" He didn't have an answer, but he held me until I could breathe again. The next day, Keisha from the support group connected us with a nonprofit that helped queer families with housing. They couldn't work miracles, but they found us a subsidized apartment in Crown Heights, a small, outdated place, but safe, with a landlord who didn't bat an eye at our identities. Moving day was a blur of cardboard boxes and sore muscles, but when we collapsed on the floor of our new home, Julian grinned. "We're still here," he said. "Still fighting." But the fight wasn't just financial. At my next checkup, the doctor warned that my hormone levels were fluctuating dangerously. Continuing the pregnancy was riskier than we'd thought. "You need to reduce stress," she said, as if that were possible. I left the clinic with a prescription I couldn't afford and a fear I couldn't shake. Julian threw himself into his art, painting late into the night. His latest piece, a vibrant mural of a phoenix rising from a cityscape, was accepted into Carla's gallery show. It wasn't much money, but it was a lifeline. I went to the opening, my belly now impossible to hide. The gallery was packed, the air buzzing with voices and wine glasses clinking. Julian's mural was the centerpiece, glowing under the lights. I saw pride in his eyes, but also exhaustion. He was carrying as much as I was, in his own way. A stranger at the gallery, an older man with a sharp suit, approached me. "You're Julian's partner?" he asked, his tone curious but not unkind. I nodded, bracing myself. "Brave, carrying a kid in this world," he said. "Not many would." I didn't know if it was a compliment or a judgment, but it stayed with me. Brave, was I? The support group became my anchor. Lena, Keisha, and the others shared their stories, triumphs, and scars. One evening, a new member, a trans teen named Sam, spoke about their fear of never finding a place in the world. I saw myself in them, the kid I'd been, terrified but defiant. "You make your place," I told them. "It's not easy, but it's yours." Saying it out loud made me believe it a little more. By the end of the third month, we were still standing, but barely. Julian's mural sold, giving us a small cushion. I landed a steady freelance client, a queer-owned bookstore that needed branding. It wasn't much, but it was hope. Still, the medical bills loomed, and my body felt like a ticking clock. Every kick from the baby was a reminder of what was at stake. Julian started singing to my belly at night, old Dominican lullabies his mom used to sing. It was the only time I felt truly at peace. But peace was fragile. One night, I woke up to sharp pains, my breath catching. Julian rushed me to the hospital, his hands shaking on the steering wheel. The ER was a blur of white coats and beeping machines. They stabilized me, but the doctor's words were a warning. "You need to take it easy, or you could lose the baby." Lose the baby. The words echoed in my head, a new kind of fear. We went home at dawn, the city waking up around us. Julian held my hand as we walked up the stairs to our apartment, his grip fierce. "We're not losing them," he said, his voice raw. "We're not." I nodded, but the fear lingered. The world was still out there, waiting to break us. But we weren't cannon fodder. Not yet. The final stretch was a marathon I wasn't sure I could finish. At 6 months pregnant, my body was a map of aches and exhaustion, but every kick from the baby was a reminder to keep going. Julian and I were surviving on grit and love, but the cracks were showing. The hospital scare had left us shaken, and the bills kept coming, relentless as the city itself. We leaned on our community harder than ever. Amara organized a crowdfunding campaign for our medical expenses, and to our shock, it gained traction. Strangers, queer folks, allies, artists donated what they could, leaving messages of support that made me cry. "You're not alone," one read. "Your kid's gonna change the world." It was a lifeline, but it didn't erase the fear that we were one bad day away from losing everything. Julian's art was gaining attention, thanks to Carla's gallery. He landed a commission for a mural at a queer youth center in Queens, a project that poured his heart onto the walls. I'd visit him there, watching him paint vibrant figures of kids holding hands, their faces full of hope. "This is for them," he told me, pointing to my belly. "So they know they belong." But belonging was a fight. At a prenatal appointment, a new doctor questioned my identity, asking if I was sure about continuing the pregnancy as a trans man. I felt the room shrink, my anger rising. Julian, who'd come with me, stepped in, his voice calm but steel-edged. "He's sure, and we're doing this." The doctor backed off, but the encounter left me raw. I wasn't just fighting for my baby. I was fighting for my right to exist as their parent. The support group kept me sane. Lena invited us to her home for dinner, where we met her twins, two bright-eyed kids who called her Mama, with such love it made my heart ache. "You'll find your way," she told me. "It's messy, but it's worth it." Her wife, a soft-spoken woman named Tara, added, "You're building a family. That's power." Their words carried me through the sleepless nights. As my due date approached, the city seemed to soften just a little. Spring arrived, and the trees in Prospect Park bloomed pink and white. Julian and I walked there one evening, his arm around me, my belly heavy but full of life. We sat on a bench, the same one we'd sat on months ago, when this all felt impossible. "We're gonna be okay," he said, his voice steady. For the first time, I believed him. The delivery was a storm. I went into labor 2 weeks early, in the middle of a rainy April night. Julian drove us to the hospital, his hands steady despite the panic in his eyes. The labor was long, grueling, but the nurses were kind, calling me by my name, respecting my pronouns. When our daughter, Sophia, was born, her cry pierced the room, and I sobbed. Relief, joy, love, all at once. Julian cut the cord, his hands shaking, and when they placed her in my arms, I knew every fight had been worth it. Sophia was perfect, with Julian's dark eyes and a tiny fist that gripped my finger like she knew me already. We took her home to our little apartment, now filled with hand-me-down baby clothes and a crib from Amara. The world hadn't changed. It was still harsh, still judgmental, but we were parents, a family, and no one could take that from us. Months later, at Sophia's first birthday, we threw a party in the park. Amara, Keisha, Lena, and a dozen others came, bringing food and laughter. Julian painted a banner with Sophia's name in bright colors, and I watched her giggle in his arms, her tiny hands reaching for the balloons. The city hummed around us, but in that moment, it was just us, our chosen family, our daughter, our love. I thought back to the clinic, to the fear, to the voices that called us cannon fodder. They were wrong. We weren't disposable. We were fighters, and we'd built something beautiful against all odds. Sophia would grow up knowing that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice, a battle, a promise. And we'd keep fighting for her, for us, for every queer family carving out their place in the world.